November 23, 1962, 2:45 p.m., north side of Youngstown, Ohio. 12-year-old Charlie Cavallaro Jr. climbs into the back seat of his father's Cadillac. His younger brother Tommy, 11 years old, slides in beside him. Their father, Charles Cadillac Charlie Cavallaro Sr., 60 years old, silver-haired, dressed in an expensive suit, turns the ignition key. The engine roars to life. 1 second passes. 2 seconds. Then the world explodes. The blast is so powerful, it lifts the Cadillac 3 feet off the ground. The hood flies 50 feet into the air. Windows shatter for 2 blocks. Neighbors sprint from their homes to find a scene from hell. The car is a twisted metal coffin. Tommy Cavallaro is dead instantly. His father dies in the wreckage. And Charlie Jr., thrown clear by the force of the explosion, lies on the pavement, his body shredded, hip destroyed, face covered in blood and gasoline. He will survive, barely. But his childhood is over. This wasn't just another mob hit. This was the murder of a child, and it would mark the end of the bloodiest mob war in American history. A war that left more than 50 bodies scattered across one Ohio city. A war that turned Youngstown into Bomb City, USA. This is the story of how 2 crime families, Pittsburgh and Cleveland, fought a 20-year battle for control of a blue-collar steel town caught in the middle. From policy kings to car bomb specialists, from corrupt cops to terrified civilians, this is the Buffalo-Pittsburgh mob war that left 50 dead in Youngstown, Ohio. But here's what the FBI files don't tell you. This wasn't really about Buffalo or Pittsburgh or Cleveland. This was about greed, about old country blood feuds that crossed the Atlantic, about Sicilians versus Calabresi, about men who refused to bow, and about a city so corrupt that the Saturday Evening Post called it Crimetown USA, where officials hobnobbed openly with criminals, and the Mafia controlled everyone from the police chief to the county prosecutor. This is that story, every word of it true. To understand how Youngstown became America's most dangerous mob battleground, you have to go back to 1910. Back when steel mills stretched as far as the eye could see, their furnaces painting the sky with 15-foot flames. Youngstown wasn't just a steel town. It was the heart of an industrial empire. The valley twisted through northern Ohio like a corridor of fire and prosperity, drawing immigrants by the thousands. Poles and Greeks and Italians and Slovaks. Men who thought they'd found the Ruhr Valley of America. Men who worked 12-hour shifts in mills so hot you could fry an egg on the floor. Men who drank hard, gambled harder, and asked no questions when certain other men came around collecting protection money. By the 1920s, Youngstown's streets were lined with after-hours joints. Steel workers drank bootleg whiskey and played barbut, a Turkish dice game the locals loved. And watching over it all, dressed in white-brimmed hats and armed with stilettos, were the capos, the made men, the wise guys who ran the numbers, or the bug, as Youngstown called it. But here's the thing about Youngstown. It was too small to have its own family. Unlike New York or Chicago or Detroit, Youngstown couldn't sustain an independent operation. It needed a sponsor, and that meant it became contested territory. By 1950, as gambling and bootlegging mushroomed into a multi-million-dollar industry, the Pittsburgh family and the Cleveland family began circling. Both wanted Youngstown. Neither would back down. And that's when the bombs started. The real war begins with one man, Sandy Naples. Born Giuseppe Naples in 1921 in Cavallaro, Italy, a hilltop town halfway between the heel and boot of the Italian peninsula. Neapolitan roots, not Sicilian, not Calabrese. That distinction would matter. Sandy came to America as a boy, settled in Youngstown, and by the 1940s, he was running policy games out of the Center Sandwich shop on the north side. Policy was simple. You picked 3 numbers. If they hit, you won. If they didn't, The house kept your money. And in Youngstown, everyone played. Steelworkers bet their lunch money. Housewives bet their grocery cash. Even kids ran numbers for pocket change. Sandy Naples was the policy king of Youngstown. By 1955, he was pulling in $30,000 a month. That's $284,000 in today's money, every single month. He didn't kick up to Pittsburgh. He didn't kick up to Cleveland. He ran his own show. And that was his first mistake. His second mistake was partnering with Vince De Niro, a Cleveland-connected operator who ran Cicero's restaurant downtown. De Niro was flashy, loud. He drove a new convertible and wore expensive suits. Sandy was quieter, more careful. Together they controlled 70% of Youngstown's gambling. They had cops on the payroll, judges in their pocket. Even the chief of police looked the other way. For a while, it worked. But the old families in Pittsburgh and Cleveland were watching, and they wanted their cut. Here's how the Mafia works. You can operate independently for a while, especially in border territories. But eventually, someone notices. Someone with power. Someone with soldiers. And when that happens, you get a visit, a polite conversation, a friendly suggestion. Pay us 20% and we'll protect you. Refuse, and you won't live long enough to regret it. In 1958, representatives from both families came to Youngstown. Pittsburgh sent Big Dom Palermo, a hulking Calabrese enforcer who ran the Briar Hill Social Club. Cleveland sent men connected to Jack Licavoli, a ruthless Sicilian known as Blackie or Jack White, who would later become boss of the entire Cleveland family. They sat down with Sandy Naples and Vince De Niro. The message was simple. This is our territory now. You work for us. Vince De Niro saw the writing on the wall. He aligned with Cleveland. He started kicking up his percentage. He played the game. Sandy Naples refused. He told them he built this operation from nothing. He told them Youngstown wasn't Cleveland or Pittsburgh territory. He told them to go to hell. That was his third mistake, his last mistake. On March 11th, 1960, at 9:30 p.m., Sandy Naples pulled up to his girlfriend's house on Youngstown's north side. Mary Ann Vrancic, 26 years old, beautiful, waiting for him on the front porch. Sandy stepped out of his car, carrying flowers. He was 39 years old, at the peak of his power, untouchable, or so he thought. Two men stepped from the shadows. Shotguns. They opened fire at point-blank range. Sandy went down first, his chest torn open. Mary Ann screamed and tried to run. They shot her in the back. She fell across the porch steps, still breathing. Then they walked up and shot her again. Execution style, both dead within 60 seconds. The killers vanished into the night. No witnesses came forward. No arrests were made. But everyone knew who ordered it. 3 days before the murder, there had been a meeting, a sit-down between Pittsburgh and Cleveland representatives at a restaurant in Niles, Ohio, just outside Youngstown. They discussed the Sandy Naples problem. They agreed on a solution. He had to go, and so he went. Sandy's death should have ended it. That's how these things usually work. You kill the boss, you take over his operation, everyone moves on. But Sandy Naples had 3 brothers: Billy Naples, Jimmy Jinx Naples, Joey Naples. And in the Mafia, blood means everything. The Naples brothers didn't go to the cops. They didn't file a lawsuit. They declared war, and Youngstown became a killing field. First to die was Vince De Niro. July 17, 1961, midnight. De Niro left his restaurant and walked to his car parked on Market Street downtown. Late model convertible, top down. Beautiful summer night. He slid behind the wheel, turned the key, and the bomb detonated. The explosion was so massive it blew out windows 50 yards away. De Niro's body was shredded, his head nearly severed. His car burned for 20 minutes before firefighters could approach. Investigators found 12 sticks of dynamite wired to the ignition. Overkill. A message. This is what happens when you betray your friends. This is what happens when you side with Cleveland. The Naples faction had struck back, but Cleveland wasn't going to let that stand. Enter Julius Moyo, a bomb specialist, a craftsman. A man who could wire a car so precisely that it would detonate exactly when he wanted it to. Cleveland hired him, paid him $5,000, gave him a list of targets, and Moyo went to work. Billy Naples was next. July 1st, 1962. Billy was Sandy's younger brother, 34 years old, running the family's gambling operations. He knew he was marked. He'd survived 2 previous attempts on his life. He checked his car every morning for bombs. He varied his routes. He never stayed in one place too long. But Moyo was patient. He waited until Billy let his guard down for just one moment. Billy climbed into his car outside a social club on the north side. He checked under the hood. Nothing. He checked under the chassis. Nothing. He got in, turned the key, and the blast tore through the vehicle like the hand of God. Investigators found his body 30 feet from the wreckage. The bomb had been placed under the driver's seat, not under the hood, or attached to the ignition. A new technique. Moyo's signature. The press reported it was the 75th bombing in Youngstown in a decade. 75. Let that sink in. One small city. 75 bombs. And it still wasn't over. The Naples brothers regrouped. They still had soldiers, they still had money, and they had rage. They targeted Cleveland-connected operators all over Youngstown. Small-time bookies, loan sharks, anyone who'd sided against them. Bodies started piling up. A gambler found in his car, shot 6 times in the face. A bookie discovered in a ditch outside town, hands tied, throat cut. An enforcer gunned down in broad daylight outside a diner. The violence was spiraling out of control. The FBI opened an investigation. They called it Operation Cavbomb. But before they could make progress, the war reached its horrifying climax. Charlie Cavallaro Sr. was a survivor. Born in Sicily in 1902, he'd entered America illegally through New Orleans in 1921. He'd worked his way up through Rochester, Buffalo, and Pittsburgh. He'd done heavy work. That's mob code for killing. Charlie wasn't an earner. He was muscle. In Pittsburgh, he'd been part of a crew that killed 2 of the Volpe brothers in a bloody mob war. That murder triggered retaliation that reached all the way to New York. The commission got involved. Pittsburgh boss John Bazzano was called to a meeting in Brooklyn. He thought he was being honored. Instead, they ice-picked him to death and dumped his body on the side of the road. After that, Charlie's crew was marked. They were all supposed to die, but Albert Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner himself, intervened. Anastasia liked Charlie. He sponsored him, brought him into the family, saved his life. One of Charlie's partners stayed in Pittsburgh and was murdered shortly after. Charlie moved to New York, worked under Anastasia, then did jobs for Detroit, and eventually settled in Youngstown. By 1960, he was 60 years old. He ran a pool hall. He operated bar-butt games. He had a wife, 2 young sons. He thought his killing days were behind him. But Charlie had made a fatal error. He'd aligned with Cleveland. He'd taken their side in the war against the Naples family. And in November 1962, Julius Moyo wired his Cadillac. 12 sticks of dynamite, placed directly under the driver's seat. Moyo later confessed he knew Charlie's sons would be in the car. He didn't care. The bomb was designed to kill everyone inside. When the Cavallaro Cadillac exploded on that cold November afternoon, it sent shockwaves far beyond Youngstown. A child was dead. Tommy Cavallaro, 11 years old, killed by the Mafia. Charlie Jr. survived, but would endure 30 surgeries over the next 5 years. His hip was destroyed. Doctors said he'd never walk again. He proved them wrong, but the scars, physical and psychological, would last forever. The Saturday Evening Post ran a cover story, Crimetown USA. Youngstown has had 75 bombings, 11 killings in a decade, and no one seems to care. The national media descended, Congress held hearings, the FBI tripled its Youngstown presence. And the mob war, finally, mercifully, came to an end. Why did it stop? Not because of law enforcement, not because of public outrage. It stopped because the killing of Tommy Cavallaro was bad for business. The commission in New York sent word, "Enough, too much heat, too much attention, you're destroying a profitable territory. Sit down and divide it." And that's exactly what happened. In January 1963, representatives from Pittsburgh and Cleveland met in a smoke-filled room in Warren, Ohio. John LaRocca represented Pittsburgh. Jack Licavoli represented Cleveland. They drew invisible lines across a map. Cleveland would control the east side of Youngstown and the suburbs. Pittsburgh would control the west side and the Briar Hill neighborhood. The Naples family, what was left of it, would operate under Pittsburgh's protection. Kelly Manarino, a Pittsburgh underboss, personally sponsored Joey Naples, the youngest brother, and made him a soldier in the Pittsburgh family by the mid-1980s. The Cleveland faction got Vince De Niro's old operations. Youngstown was officially divided. The war was over, but the damage was done. Let's talk numbers. Between 1950 and 1970, Youngstown experienced at least 82 car bombings. 53 people were murdered in mob-related killings. Not one arrest led to a conviction. 0. The FBI investigated. They had informants. They had wiretaps. They even had a top echelon informant, a made member who was feeding them information. But every time they built a case, witnesses disappeared. Evidence vanished. Judges were bribed. Juries were intimidated. In 1963, an FBI agent named Stanley Peterson wrote a memo to J. Edgar Hoover. The memo described Youngstown as the most corrupt city in America. Peterson had cultivated a source, an Italian man who'd been offered induction into the local mob. The source told Peterson he wanted no part of it. "My brothers are members, and I don't like the guy who runs it." But Hoover wrote back with an extraordinary order. "Use your persuasion techniques. If the offer comes up again, persuade him to take it." Hoover wanted a mole inside the Youngstown mob, and he got one. That informant revealed something stunning. Youngstown wasn't really controlled by Cleveland or Pittsburgh. It was split between two Italian factions that operated semi-independently. The Sicilians, connected to Cleveland, and the Calabrese, connected to Pittsburgh. They worked together when it suited them. They killed each other when it didn't. They held induction ceremonies in basements in Canfield, Ohio. They made their own members, and for nearly 2 decades, they operated with near-total impunity. But by the 1970s, the old guard was dying off. The steel mills were closing, the money was drying up, and a new generation of mobsters was taking over. Men like Lenny Strollo, who would become the last great mob boss of Youngstown. Men who traded bombs for corruption, replacing violence with political control. But that's another story. This story ends with Charlie Cavallaro Jr., 12 years old, lying on a stretcher outside his destroyed home. His father dead, his brother dead, his body broken. FBI agents took photos of him in the hospital. They used those images in training manuals for decades. This is what happens when the mob goes too far. This is what happens when greed and rage replace discipline and order. This is what happens in Bomb City, USA. Charlie Jr. never spoke about the bombing for 61 years. Not to reporters, not to documentary filmmakers, not even to his own family. He buried the trauma deep and built a life. He worked. He married. He had children. He became a grandfather. And then, in 2023, he finally told his story. He met with the last surviving FBI agent who worked the CAV bomb case. Cecil Moses, 89 years old, who'd been sent to Youngstown by Bobby Kennedy himself. They sat together and relived that day. Charlie described hearing the explosion, feeling the heat, waking up on the ground, unable to move, unable to understand why his brother wasn't answering him. Moses described the crime scene, the forensic evidence, the 12 sticks of dynamite, the precise wiring, the intentional placement to maximize casualties. He described how the FBI knew who ordered the hit but could never prove it in court, how the witnesses were too terrified to testify, how the judges were too corrupt to convict, and he described the frustration, the rage, the sense that Youngstown was a lost cause, a city where the Mafia had won. But here's the truth. The mob didn't win. They destroyed themselves. By 1963, Youngstown was a wasteland. The bombings had scared away legitimate businesses. Insurance companies refused to cover properties. Investors pulled out. The steel industry was already in decline, and the mob violence accelerated it. By the 1980s, Youngstown's population had dropped by 30,000. The mills were shuttered. The downtown was boarded up. The mob had killed the golden goose. And what happened to the men who started this war? Julius Moyo, the bomb maker, was himself killed in 1963, shot 6 times in a Cleveland alley. No one was ever charged. Jack Licavoli, the Cleveland underboss who helped orchestrate Sandy Naples' murder, became boss of the Cleveland family in 1976. He died in federal prison in 1985, serving a 17-year sentence for racketeering and murder. Kelly Manorino, the Pittsburgh underboss who divided Youngstown, died of natural causes in 1980. His faction faded into obscurity. Joey Naples, Sandy's youngest brother, operated quietly in Youngstown until August 19, 1991, when he was shot to death in a mob hit. He was 70 years old. No one was ever charged. Jimmy Jinx Naples, the brains behind the family, died peacefully in 1996. He'd outlived all his enemies. And Charlie Cavallaro Jr., he's alive today, living quietly, rarely speaking about the past. But he agreed to one interview in 2023. He stood on the exact spot where his garage once stood, where the bomb exploded, where his childhood ended. And he said something profound. He said, "I don't hate them. I don't hate the men who did this. They were products of a system, a culture, a world where violence was currency and loyalty was measured in blood. But I'll never understand how they could put a bomb in a car knowing 2 children would be inside. That's not mafia. That's not honor. That's just murder." The Youngstown mob war lasted 20 years. It claimed at least 50 lives. It terrorized an entire city. And it exposed the lie at the heart of the American Mafia. The lie that there were rules, that civilians were off-limits, that honor meant something. Youngstown proved that when territory and money were at stake, there were no rules. There was only survival, only power, only the cold mathematics of violence. And in the end, everyone lost. The Naples family was destroyed. The Cleveland family was weakened. The Pittsburgh family fragmented. And Youngstown, once a thriving industrial powerhouse, became a ghost town, a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when organized crime isn't just organized, but total. When corruption isn't the exception, but the foundation. When fear isn't a tactic, but a way of life. Today, if you drive through Youngstown, you can still see the remnants: empty storefronts, abandoned houses, rusting factories. The Briar Hill neighborhood, once the heart of the Italian community, is largely demolished. The center sandwich shop, where Sandy Naples ran his empire, is long gone. The social clubs are closed. The restaurants are shuttered. But the memory remains. Old-timers still talk about the bombings, about the bodies, about the days when you checked under your car every morning before turning the key, when you heard an explosion and knew, without asking, that someone had just been murdered. When the Mafia wasn't a movie or a TV show, but the government, the real power, the force that controlled everything. The FBI eventually broke Youngstown's mob in the late 1990s. An agent named Bob Kroner spent 20 years building cases. He used wiretaps and informants and relentless pressure. He flipped soldiers. He arrested bosses. He sent Lenny Strollo, the last great don of Youngstown, to prison for 13 years. Strollo cooperated. He testified against corrupt politicians, judges, and cops. The entire system collapsed. But by then, it didn't matter. Youngstown was already dead. The mob hadn't just controlled the city, they'd cannibalized it, drained it dry, left it a husk, and when they finally fell, there was nothing left to save. So what's the lesson here? What do we learn from the Buffalo-Pittsburgh mob war that left 50 dead in Youngstown, Ohio? We learn that violence, no matter how organized, eventually consumes itself. That greed, no matter how lucrative, eventually destroys its source. That corruption, no matter how pervasive, eventually collapses under its own weight. Sandy Naples refused to pay tribute, and it cost him his life. Billy Naples sought revenge, and it cost him his life. Vince De Niro chose sides, and it cost him his life. Charlie Cavallaro took a contract, and it cost his son's life. Julius Moyo built bombs, and it cost him his life. Every single one of them believed they were smart enough, tough enough, connected enough to survive. Every single one of them was wrong. And the city they fought over, Youngstown, Ohio, it paid the highest price of all. It became Bomb City, USA, Crimetown, a place where for 20 years the Mafia was the law. And where, when the smoke finally cleared and the bodies were buried, nothing remained but ruins and regret. If you found this story compelling, hit that subscribe button. We release a new mob documentary every single week, diving deep into the untold stories of organized crime in America. Drop a comment below. What other mob wars should we cover? What cities? What families? And if you know someone from Youngstown, someone who remembers those days, share this with them. These stories need to be told. These voices need to be heard. This is Mob's History. Untold stories from the world of organized crime. Until next time.